This is the Coaching Leader Podcast, a podcast about coaching, leadership, and leading through coaching. And here's your host, Scott Gress.
How can leaders use coaching in ministry? A couple of weeks ago, I was teaching a class on basic coaching skills. In this particular instance, they were 12 pastors who were all being trained in coaching because they were going to be working with congregations to help them to live into a change process. And during the dialogue at one point, one of the participants said, "Well, you obviously can't use coaching in leadership or as a pastor." And I immediately jumped in and I said, "Oh, I have to disagree." And so then I went on to explain how coaching could be used in leadership and in ministry. And then it occurred to me that'd be a great thing to address on the podcast. After all, we call it the Coaching Leader Podcast. And that was deliberately named that way because coaching can be used in leadership. Yeah, a lot of the times we assume that coaching is a one-on-one experience where you're talking with somebody personally and you're helping them to live into some changes, or you're helping them to develop as a person or develop in a particular skill. And that's all true. But it's so much more. Coaching can be used in a lot of different ways. Well, let me put it this way. When it comes to your leadership, or even pastoral leadership, how do you want to show up? Sometimes we have a lot of assumptions there too. Pastors understand what it means to show up as teacher, to show up and be the preacher, to be the worship leader. They would know what it means to show up and be the caring shepherd and to express pastoral care. And so you kind of appropriately put on those hats, if you will, depending upon the situation that you're in, and then you live into being the teacher or being the preacher or being the caring shepherd. But the challenge comes in when you're graduated from seminary and you get into the middle of a congregation and you need to show up at the council meeting or at the voters meeting, or somebody walks into your office. How are you going to show up? What are the behaviors that you're going to exhibit? What hat are you going to put on? What are the words that you're going to say? Well, a lot of the time when we think of leadership, sometimes this caricature of leadership that we put on is all the way at the end of the scale. Tannenbaum and Schmidt identified this continuum. On the one end of the continuum is somebody who emphasizes authoritarian leadership. What the boss says goes. They have a powerful voice, and people listen to the boss, and they carry themselves with a certain amount of credibility and authority. Maybe it's even inherent in that particular position. And then at the other end of the scale is somebody who leads in a more participative style, where they get a lot of other people involved. And so pastors, sometimes I'll identify pastors in this presentation. Pastors kind of have the idea that if I'm going to show up as a leader, I either need to show up at the one end of the scale, being very authoritarian, or maybe I don't want to appear that way with all of the problems that are associated with it, and instead show up as the guy who's trying to engineer a more participative experience for folks. They don't like the one end of the scale because that feels too authoritarian. They feel too much like the boss. And maybe it doesn't set well with them as a caring shepherd. On the other hand, some people, they kind of like the idea of being in charge and telling people what to do. My way or the highway, a command and demand kind of leadership. And maybe their personality can carry it off, but if the truth be told, after the short term, People don't really respond very well to an authoritarian kind of leader. But then what about that participative style? Should a pastor show up as a leader with that participative style? Well, that's good. But I've found in my experience in coaching pastors that oftentimes they show up in that participative style by saying things like, well, whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter to me, but what do you want to do? In kind of an agreeableness that sacrifices or gives up their voice. So, where do you go? How do you show up? What can you do? Well, coaching allows you to show up in another way. It's another way to help. It's another very productive way to lead. Let me give you a few examples. If somebody walks into your office and they says, Pastor, what should we do about blank? You immediately have a choice. Which hat are you going to put on? Are you going to put on the teaching hat, the preaching hat, the pastoral care hat? Are you going to be the command and demand kind of leader? Or are you going to be the participative kind of leader? But what kind of behavior and what kind of words fit with each? Or could you show up as a coach? If you were the command and demand kind of authoritarian leader, you would say, you definitely have to do it this way. And let me tell you what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. The job might get done, but it wouldn't have the depth of ownership for that person that you're talking to who came into your office. Or they might even think to themselves, well, I'll do it their way, but if it doesn't work, I'm off the hook. It's going to be their fault because they told me what to do. And also, does that really help for their development? Are they really growing through that experience? Well, you just gave them a fish rather than teaching them how to fish. And then on the other hand, if you say, well, whatever you want to do, however you want to do it, that's fine. That participative style, that doesn't quite work either, because then they're left with, I wanted some help. I wanted somebody to come alongside me. So what kind of hat are you going to put on? The coaching hat might look like this. Well, I've got some ideas on what you should do and how you should do it, but I'd really love to hear what you have to say. Or even just straight up, well, what do you think? And then encourage them to talk. And then encourage them to think it through. Yeah, how would you do that? Where would you get the resources? What would you like the outcome to be? Who else could you get involved? With those questions, you're helping them to think it through, and it's their job. It's their decision. It's their idea. They thought it through with your help, putting on the coaching hat. Is that leadership? Absolutely. They would own it, and they would probably perform it with greater intensity and determination than if you just told them, yeah, you need to do it this way. Let's think of another example. You're at a meeting. It's the church council, maybe the board of directors, and you want to show up. You want to be somebody who's present. You want to participate in the dialogue. But then there's the question of what kind of hat are you going to wear? Are you going to decide, be the tie-breaking vote when they're trying to determine what to do and how to do it and when to do it? Are you going to usurp the authority of the board chair? And when do you do that? Is that very respectful? Is that honoring their role, their elected role in the congregation? Probably not. Are you doing it because you want to be in charge? Because you want the credit? You want to have the satisfaction of being able to tell them what the idea is? Or are you going to just sit back and not say anything? Just kind of let it play out. And if they get in a fight, well, that's their problem. You can maybe pray at the end. So what hat are you going to wear? How about showing up by putting on the coaching hat? And so you can certainly affirm the chairperson's role. and they can lead the meeting, they can lead the discussion. And when they turn to you as the pastor and say, well, what do you think, Pastor? What could you say? And what could you do? You could say, point them to the end goal, the vision and mission of the congregation. Well, which idea, if you're talking about two competing ideas that are on the table at that point, which idea would help us reach the vision that God has given us for this ministry? Which one uses the resources that we have, or would best take advantage of the skills and the gifts that are involved in this congregation? Helping them think it through. You're modeling for them the kind of things that are needed to make good decisions. And so you're teaching them how to fish. And you're also not telling them what to do, and you're not usurping the authority of the board chair. And at the end, they'll say, wow, that was really helpful, Pastor. At the same time, though, you'll see you'll be keeping them aligned with what they've already said is their goal, their desire, what they believe is God's vision for the congregation. You're helping them to be good stewards of the gifts and the people that are involved in the ministry. You're helping them to do what they want to do. And you're helping them to align with God's will too when you say, well, what does God want? What does God want us to do? How does He want us to do it? What are the criteria in order to be faithful to God's calling and the scriptures in this particular situation? And that's leadership. Let me give you one more example. How about when you have a voters' assembly or that congregational meeting where you're going to be discussing things and helping the congregation to come to a conclusion, a vote on a project that needs to be done, a building that needs to be built, a person who needs to be called to that congregation for full-time ministry or otherwise. What do you do as the pastor? You sit at the front table, kind of implying that you're also in charge. Maybe you feel like you need that for your own ego, that you're one of the people, one of the leaders in that congregation. Or do you sit in the back? No, this is their show. This is the elected leaders of the congregation, and I'm kind of hands off. I'll let them kind of do it. Well, then you've given up your voice. You've given up your place in participating. Are you going to sit somewhere on the side? Well, and regardless of where you sit, as the chairperson is running the meeting, as things are going forward, what happens when they turn to you and say, well, what do you think, Pastor? Well, you've got a decision to make. What hat are you going to wear? Are you going to wear the authoritarian leadership hat and you're going to say, no question about it, this is what we should do? You're going to just kind of pass the baton and say, well, whatever you guys think, that's fine. Or could you show up as a coach? Ask those similar questions that you used at the council meeting or the board of directors meeting and say, well, what's our vision? How can we best live into that vision by God's grace? What are the gifts that God has given to us? What's His will as it's revealed in the scriptures? What's our community like? What does this community need to see God's hands and feet at work through us? And as you ask those questions, showing up like a coach, that will provide incredible leadership. So there's a lot of ways that you can show up as a leader. But let me go back to another point that I'd made earlier. How do you want to show up? Do you want to show up as the person who's kind of in control, the authoritarian? Maybe you got more issues going on than you want to admit. Or do you want to just kind of give up? Maybe you've been burned before. Maybe somebody's criticized you before, and maybe it hurt. Maybe you've been blamed before, and so you're just kind of hands off. Well, a good way to show up is as a coach. And let me share with you another quick story. A few weeks ago, I was in a International Coach Federation day-long event, and we were meeting with a number of coaches in the South Florida area. And I sat next to a guy who was a master certified coach. That's the highest level of certification that you can get. And as we were talking about coaching and the various levels of certification and so forth, he said, you know, the deeper you get into this and the greater certification, it's not just something you do or a technique that you follow, but it's how you show up and how you are. And I would say that goes along with a lot of things. We certainly want to show up as our authentic selves, as the people who are baptized children of God, who are identified as being in Christ. But we've also got a decision to make if we are going to be a pastor, a teacher, a preacher, a consultant, or a coach. What kind of leader are we going to be? How do you want to show up? And how can you do that more intentionally? It's my contention that you can be a coaching leader. Reach out to me at scottgress.com, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you and talk about how you can be a coaching leader. Thanks for watching.